This is Danielle DiMartino Booth with Valuetainment Economics. I'm bringing you today an audience with Jeffery Gundlach, founder of DoubleLine. We're here in Los Angeles, and we hope you enjoy our conversation. Welcome. Have you seen Between Two Ferns? Okay.
I have seen it. I saw Barack Obama on it, I think.
Funny movie.
That's with that Zach guy, right?
Yeah, just reminded me of that. But let's start off with something serious. Where were you when Scott Norwood missed the field goal in 1991?
Let's see. I was in my family room in Santa Monica, in my first house. I thought he was going to miss it, but
8 seconds to go.
Yeah, but in those days, I think it was 47 yards. I think it was 45. But in those days, it wasn't so automatic. These days, a 45-yarder, they make it all the time. The kickers have gotten so much better. You wonder why kickers are so much better, because you would think that there's no new technology or anything involved.
It's a leg.
Yeah, and maybe they're better at strengthening the legs somehow through advanced science.
That was my way of saying you were born and raised in Buffalo.
That's right. Yeah, and I had never been to a Bills game when that happened. I had never been to one. We couldn't afford stuff like that when I was a kid, and then I moved out of Buffalo. And the first professional football game that I went to was actually the Bills getting killed by the Cowboys in Pasadena, because that was right in town. And we were actually ahead in that game for about a minute and a half. And then Jim Kelly was knocked out, and I knew it was over.
Full disclaimer, grew up an Oilers fan, San Antonio.
Well, then that Bills comeback had to be painful.
So I've done a little bit of research, some interviews you've done in the past, and I also grew up poor, and I also had a broken dryer when I was a kid. In my case, it meant going to the laundromat to dry the clothes.
My mom had to hang the stuff in the basement in the winter, and she would hang it on the line outside the house in the summer. And that's actually pretty pleasant, because you get this kind of fresh air kind of deal going. But when you're a kid, you make lemonade out of lemons. So we had, down in the basement, we built a maze out of throws that we had to buy to cover the couch, because the couch wore out, and we didn't have enough money to buy a couch. Because look, if you can't buy a dryer, you can't buy a couch. So what you do is you buy a cloth, and you throw it on top of the couch so it doesn't look so shabby, and then that wears out. And so we stored them up, and we made mazes in the basement to play tag in the wintertime. Because in Buffalo in the winter, there's not a lot to do other than snowball fight. We built a hockey rink in our backyard by just shoveling the snow. And when you shovel the snow, because there's so much snow in Buffalo, you get boards, essentially, which is the old snow. And your Zamboni machine is a hose, a garden hose, and it actually works pretty well.
Yep.
And so that was pretty good. But there was actually a bowling craze. A lot of people, there's been manias over and over in financial markets. And when I was a kid, there was actually a bowling mania, if you can believe it. Bowling stocks were the hot area.
Publicly traded companies.
Yeah, AMC, I think, made bowling balls or bowling shoes or something.
Still do, but yeah.
And weirdly, bowling was super popular briefly. Kind of like tennis was, I think, like in the 70s and 80s, and it's kind of fallen off somewhere. Yeah.
What was your first job as a kid?
I was a substitute newspaper deliverer.
Substitute?
Yeah, it was like there was a kid in the neighborhood, and my brother actually was that kid for a while. That would have a paper route, and you would deliver door to door. But whoever the guy was, the kid that had the paper route, they'd go on vacation. Their family would go on vacation. Somebody had to fill in.
Right.
And so that was my very first job. I mowed lawns. I don't know if that counts. That probably was the second job. Got like $3 for mowing a lawn.
$3.
Yeah. I shoveled snow for the neighbor across the way. I can't remember what he paid me. I don't think it was $3. But it was just to get walking around money.
Did you like school when you were young?
No, I didn't like it at all. I was bored out of my mind. I would just stare at the clock, and I would do a thing like prisoners do, I think, at least in the comic books or on TV and the movies, where they do the days, on the side of the cell. You've seen that kind of depiction, right? Well, I would do that watching the clock, how many minutes to go in the class. It was like, so obviously I was metaphorically feeling like I was a prisoner. because it was so incredibly dull.
But you probably got great grades.
Sure, I got straight A's.
SATs?
Sure, I was virtually perfect. I heard a perfect score on my GRE for math for graduate school.
Did you pick Dartmouth, or did Dartmouth pick you?
I went to my guidance counselor in high school, and my brother had gone to Princeton, which was very controversial in my family. They were very class conscious, and my grandparents thought that that wasn't our place, if you will. And my brother finagled his way to claim that he wanted to go into architecture, and Princeton was reputed to be great in architecture.
Right.
And my parents wanted me to go to University of Buffalo, which is where my father and my uncles went, because it was cheap.
Yeah.
And my brother didn't want to go there, and so he finagled this scheme. I think it was largely fabricated, that since University of Buffalo didn't have a great architecture department, he couldn't go there. I don't think he took a single architecture class at Princeton. But I went to my guidance counselor and I said, he goes, where do you want to go to college? I said, I don't know, I want to study like math. And he says, well, Colgate's good, and Dartmouth is good, and Yale is good, and University of Buffalo is actually good at math. So I applied to those 4 schools. And I didn't visit any of them before I applied. I just applied to 4 schools, and I got in, and I visited them, and I really liked Dartmouth, just the feel of the place when I got there. And so I decided to go there.
Anybody who knows you would understand the math aspect.
Yeah.
What was up with philosophy?
Well, after the first term at Dartmouth, I came back to Buffalo for the winter break, and I went over, hung out with 2 of my best friends from high school, and we were sitting in the kitchen, and they were talking about they had taken Philosophy 101, and they had coincidentally, one went to Stanford, and the other one, I think he went to Princeton actually, ironically. And they talked about how they liked...
What was in the water in your town?
Yeah, they liked philosophy.
There's a lot of smart kids.
They liked actually, my high school spoke about that for years, if not decades afterward. My class was like remarkably, I don't know, maybe it was something in the water, like you say, or maybe it was the fluoride or something. But they talked about how they really liked philosophy, and they went through some of the basic things that you do in Philosophy 101, like, choice versus fate and all this sort of stuff. And I thought, that sounds pretty interesting, so I started taking it.
Well, it's not boring.
And I just took one after another, and before I knew it, I had enough for a major in both math and philosophy individually. It's just one of those things, like Doug Flutie said when he played for the Bills. I remember him saying, all I'm trying to do is get a first down. I'm just trying to get a first down, and eventually you just run out of field. And if you keep getting first downs...
Just keep getting first downs.
You end up getting the touchdown. And that was kind of how I ended up in math and philosophy. I liked it, and I kept taking it. Next thing I knew, I had a dual major.
What was the most pragmatic thing you learned in any of your studies? We're talking about applicability to the real world.
When I studied in graduate school at Yale for theoretical mathematics, the only thing that we talked about that had any practical application is we were doing a combinatorics thing that related to the Rubik's Cube in kind of a metaphorical way. That was it. But the way it works is the more you study biology, the more it turns into chemistry. The more you study chemistry, the more it turns into physics. The more you study physics, the more it turns into math. And the more you study math, it turns into philosophy.
Well, if you think back to the ancient Greeks, that's kind of true, isn't it?
I think it's really literally true even to this day. That's kind of the sequence of it. And there's actually philosophy involved in math. A lot of people don't understand that because they think of math as arithmetic or calculus. But the whole idea of meta layers of infinities is really philosophical, and it's interesting because a lot of this meta infinity stuff has absolutely no practical application at all, and it never will, because infinity doesn't exist.
Right. That is deep.
So it's a weird study of an intellectual precept that actually is completely flawed. And this is what I was studying when I was studying mathematics at Yale in graduate school. I wanted to debunk Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which is one of the great theorems people say of the 20th century, and it basically revolves around layers of infinity. And since infinity doesn't exist, the theorem is actually not valid. And I got bait and switched. I had an advisor that encouraged me to do this, and then at the last minute they said, you can't do that here. We study Lie algebras, where as a graduate student, your thesis is basically a chapter in our next Lie algebra textbook. And I just said, I'm not doing this, and I left.
So this is a little off script, but is there corruption in academia?
There's politics in academia, which I was so naive. I really thought that it was like intellectual purity, and you go and you become a professor, and everything's just incredibly stimulating intellectually, and nobody has an agenda. I think I was at Yale for about a day when that myth got exploded, and I realized that it's just another group of people that have all of the dynamics that groups of people have, and the fact that they're college professors doesn't really change that dynamic at all.
Well, I have to ask, my dad was raised in East Haven. He actually went off to Yukon, and then Vietnam came. But he grew up in East Haven. Did you ever make it to Pepe's Pizza?
I don't think so. I don't think I made it to East Haven.
No, Pepe's Pizza's in New Haven. We would go into New Haven to go to Pepe's Pizza.
I didn't spend a lot of time in New Haven. I lived out in the country.
Really?
About 25 miles away from New Haven, because New Haven, I couldn't get an apartment. It was just the bottom line. I couldn't get student housing because it was very limited for graduate students.
Right.
And so I was forced to find an apartment, and there basically weren't any.
Right.
Maybe I started looking too late, too close to the school year. And so I just, they have those bulletin boards where people hang up a piece of paper with a tear out type of deal. And one was for this house in Cheshire, Connecticut. And
Cheshire's beautiful.
I drove up there and I said, this is very inconvenient locationally relative to school, but it sure is beautiful.
But you knew what to do with a snow tire, so.
Yeah, well, it was a beautiful place. I mean, it turned out that the father of this woman who was attending Yale Law School owned the house and had just renovated it, and it basically had 3 suites in it, kind of, and I shared it with these 2 other Yale students.
Huh.
And it made life kind of easy because there was really nothing to do but study. Because I'm out there in the country, I didn't have a TV, or I didn't watch it. I think one of the women there had a TV. And I had to study about 100 hours a week.
So there weren't exactly weekends hopping into New York City?
No, I think I went to New York City once, but I just studied all the time. And I got burned out on it, and I realized that there were only 2 places to go with a PhD in mathematics, and that's into the spy business, NSA, or be a professor. That's kind of it. And
I'm trying to picture as a professor, it's not happening.
Well, I was delusional, and I thought that I would be a professor. I was actually going to be a philosophy professor, but that got even more remote. And so I just decided I almost never have a problem sleeping. One of the questions you get a lot from potential investors, what keeps you up at night?
What keeps you up at night?
And I said, I'm not going there. Nothing keeps me up at night. But there was one night at Yale where I was up all night. I just couldn't, because I was like, I can't do this anymore.
I have to be a drummer?
I didn't know what, I was like, my head was kind of spinning. I was trying to figure out, well, I'm not going to do this math thing, so what am I going to do? And I was like, so maybe I'll go to business school. I thought about that. I'm like, no more school. I don't want to go to school anymore. And so I just decided.
You were clearly musically inclined.
Well, I was playing in bands, and I played in band while I was at Yale. That was the one thing I did other than study. And the lead guitar player was all hell-bent on coming to Los Angeles because there was a red-hot music scene in Los Angeles in the early 80s. And there were a lot of clubs, there was a lot going on. And so I didn't have anything better to do. So I said, let's try that. And I got my junky Chevy Monza with the stainless steel, is it? Or was it aluminum engine block, I think it was. and just drove across the country, 5, 6, 7 days, or whatever it was.
Wow.
And all day driving, and I ended up crashing on the apartment of our lead guitar player, and we started playing in bands. We made some records and stuff. we were okay. We thought we were better than we really were, I think. And we played in clubs a lot and made very little money doing it. So I had to get a real job. And I got a job working for an insurance company because they love math people at insurance companies for actuarial stuff.
Actuarials, yep.
And what shocked me is I didn't hate it.
Really?
I dreaded going in the first day, and it was amazing. After a few days, I was like, you know, I think this isn't that bad. This business world thing isn't that bad. And so I was working there, and this story's been reported many times, and it's absolutely true. I was living in Hollywood. I still had the band thing going, and all my furniture was lent to me, if you will, or donated to me by people I knew. So I had a cardboard box for a TV stand. I had, chairs that were given to me, a table that was probably this big that was to eat off of, and so on. And I was thinking about, actually then I started thinking about getting an MBA. And I even took the GMAT, I think. Is it called GMAT?
It was the GMAT.
Yeah, GMAT.
Yeah, I once took the GMAT, the LSAT, and the GRE in a 2-week window. Don't ever do that.
Yeah, and I wouldn't do that, no.
It was not good.
It's exhausting to take those tests. They go all day.
I ended up with the MBA route, obviously, but anyways.
Yeah, and so I was getting second thoughts about, I didn't want to fill out the applications for a bit. I just wouldn't, I'd leave them in the corner, and I wouldn't get to them, and I was saying, this is telling you something. You're avoiding this. You don't want to do this. And I flipped on the TV. I had 3 stations, ABC, NBC, and CBS. No cable or anything. I had actually a wire coat hanger for an antenna because it was an old black and white TV, and the dial had broken off. So I needed pliers to change the stations.
Actually, I know what you're talking about. We had a TV like that when I was growing up.
It was like this big. And so I flip it on, and I think it was on ABC. There was a show that I'd never really watched. It was called Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. Robin Leach, Champagne Wishes and Caviar Dreams. And he says, we have a special show. He's got that funny Australian English accent, whatever it is today. We're going to count down the top paying professions. And I'm like, cool, this will be, let's figure it out.
Make my list.
So amazingly, actuary was on the list. And they kept counting down, and number 1 was investment banker. And they say you have to work very hard and be very analytic, but it's the best paying profession. I'm like, I work hard all the time, and I'm extremely analytical. So I immediately went to the closet where I kept the Los Angeles Yellow Pages. It was white and yellow. It was the phone book. You don't see those much anymore. And I went to the Yellow Pages with the intention of applying to investment banking firms. But I was so naive, I expected that investment banker would be in the Yellow Pages. But it wasn't. There is no investment banker heading. But there was investment management. And I couldn't be bothered with the details. I said, that's close enough. And so I wrote a very aggressive cover letter, and had my resume, and I sent it to everyone that had a boldface ad in the Los Angeles Yellow Pages. There were about 20 of them. And I went to my job at the insurance company, and I was using their equipment to print off my resume, and this girl I was friendly with comes up to me and says, what are you doing? And I said, I'm printing off my resumes. I'm going to be an investment banker. And she looks at my list that I'm sending it to, and she says, none of these are investment banking firms. And I was like, okay. And she said, well, I'll tell you what, if you're applying to these types of firms, I used to work down the street at this one. And you can send it to this guy who's like an important guy there, so you get like an in, and his name's Glenn Wyrick. So I added them to the list. Turned out that I only got 3 replies from all the ones that I sent. One of them was like the college rejection letter, where it's like a sentence, and another one was, hey, we're a 2-man shop, you have a fascinating background, but we can't pay you anything. And I said, well, that's going to be a problem because I'm right. So
lifestyles of the rich and famous.
It turned out that I ended up getting one from the firm that this woman had told me to give me the in, and it looked like the college rejection letter too. And I was so disgusted, I didn't even read it, and I threw it in the trash. And then later that evening, the curiosity got the better of me, and I went and fished it out of the trash, and it said, "We have had a large response to our job posting, but you can give us a call. Don't get your hopes up, but give us a call." I was like, job posting? So some weird serendipity had happened that I had.
Because you had no idea that there was a job posting.
Right, I didn't know anything about it. I was just sending it to this referral, if you will, and I ended up getting an interview. And they didn't know what to make of me because I had no background whatsoever in anything even related. I had read one book. It was called Inside Wall Street, and it explained what a stock and a convertible bond. It was very, very breezy and high level type of stuff.
Not exactly liar's poker.
So I ended up getting invited back for an interview, ironically, with Glenn Wyrick, because he wasn't even the one that had sent me the thing. It was a very strange chain of events. And so I sit there and he goes, we could really use a quant like you, but I'm not sure how we would use you. What do you think you'd be more suited to, equities or fixed income? And I looked right at him and I said, I don't know what those things are. And his jaw almost hit the floor. And he said, equities, they're stocks. Oh, and fixed income, that's bonds. And I didn't tell him, but I was thinking, what are bonds? I don't know what those are. But I knew what stocks were. And I'd actually been attracted to the stock market when I was about 10 years old, maybe 12 years old, because there was a roaring bull market into the early 70s.
Right.
And there was a thing then that was a very increasingly narrow market like we have now.
Yeah.
That was called the Nifty 50.
The Nifty 50.
And one of the Nifty 50 was Xerox. And my father owned Xerox because his brother invented the commercial Xerox copier and was the head of research at Xerox.
Oh my gosh.
And so he had given him, he said, look,
Upper New York.
we're going to be going somewhere
company.
with this. He actually made it commercially viable. He had 150 patents plus, my father's brother. And so we had bought Xerox and had participated in this incredible
run-up
increase, and we were lower middle class, and for the first time ever, we actually felt like we had a little bit of money because this Xerox stock had done so well, and my mother was begging my father to sell it.
Oh.
And he never did.
Oh.
And then the bear market came, and at that time, I was in 8th grade, and there was a small week-long thing about the stock market as part of social studies, and as kind of a assignment, if you will, everyone was supposed to pick a stock and chart it or follow it day by day. And so I picked Xerox, and I remember it was like at 153, and every day it dropped like 2-3 points. Every day. It was a brutal bear market from 72 into 74.
Oh, yeah.
And it just kept dropping. It went below 100, it went down to 50, it went down. And boy, was my mother upset about that because she didn't believe in that whole stock market thing really and wanted to cash out at the top. So that's how I learned a little about stock market. But ever since that Xerox assignment, I was following the stock market, and my father had bought me shares in Pratt & Lambert because he worked at a chemical company that was purchased by Pratt & Lambert.
Yep.
And he had bought me a few shares, and so I was following that. So when the newspaper would come, I would every single day go and check on my Pratt & Lambert stock. And I was at my grandfather's house when the paper came one day, and I looked at it, and it was on the American Stock Exchange. Pratt & Lambert was.
Gosh.
And my grandfather, who had been a stockbroker in the 20s, in fact, he stayed in the stock market even though he was bearish going into the crash because he felt conflicted. How could he keep his clients in the market if he was getting out of the market? And so he ended up still being relatively wealthy for that time. But he says to me, "Why are you looking at the American? All that matters is the New York Stock Exchange." I remember him saying that to me. And so, he had been in that sort of thing. But I followed it ever since then. And anyway, I mean, that's how I ended up. I got a job finally in the bond department because they needed a quant supposedly in the bond department.
Well, I think quant's maybe a little bit more important in fixed income.
Yeah, yeah. And I was, they were so skeptical of my background that I was hired for $30,000 a year on a probationary period. I think it was 60 days, it may have been 90 days. And I spent a couple of weeks in between before I started, I had 2 weeks off, and I read all the fixed income stuff. And one was called Inside the Yield Book, which is kind of the Bible of fixed income mathematics and stuff. And it had 2 sections. There was a text, and then the second half of the book was all these formulas. And since I was fresh off of a PhD math program, I figured this is a good opportunity. I derived all the formulas from scratch myself.
Gosh.
So, and I figured everybody did this. So I walked
here's the Black-Scholes. Here's how the Black-Scholes works.
So I walked in my first day on the job thinking, you know, I'm going to be so overwhelmed by all of the depth of knowledge and all this stuff. And in a few days, I realized I know more about this than anybody here.
Oh gosh.
Because it turned out that the guy that was the bond department was a necessary evil. They were a stock firm, stock manager, but in those days, a lot of pension plans had what they called balanced accounts.
Of course.
And they gave it to one manager, both the stocks and the bonds. And they were all focused on the stocks, so somebody had to take care of this bond thing. And they hired an old crony of one of the stock guys, and he was completely worthless as an investment manager. He was awful. I mean, he always acted exclusively on emotion. Clients would actually occasionally go over their statements and say, how can it be that you bought this bond at this price and it never traded at that price? It's because he actually bought at the top tick and it never even registered in like the teller rate database or whatever it was back in those days.
Gosh.
And I thought I was doomed because I'm trapped in this department which is so incompetently managed. It took me a couple of years to realize that was actually a blessing because it provided opportunity.
Well, sure.
Because I couldn't learn anything from this guy except what not to do. But it meant that there was a lot of opportunity if you actually could provide some value.
Let's bring the Godfather into this. Closing business. You feel like Michael Corleone in the Godfather when you would close business. I read one of this is an old.
That's not true.
No.
No. What happened is there was a line that I think I misremembered slightly in the movie The Godfather, which I'd never seen. I had actually just seen a clip of it. I don't think I've ever watched that movie all the way through. And there was a thing where I think there was a wedding that's going on, and these people all come in and ask the guy, the Marlon Brando character, for favors. Mm-hmm. And there's one guy that's asking for a favor, and I'm misremembering, but he says something like, you come in here, you ask for favors, and you don't even call me Godfather. So what I purloined that concept whenever we would have a trade idea or something, and there'd be a disagreement if we were, back when I was not fully in charge of things.
Sure.
And it would be like, I think we should do this, and someone else thinks they should do that. And if it would turn out that I was more right than the other people in terms of, I was right about 70% of the time, and they were generally right about 49, which is the case with most investors. And when it would work out my way, I would say, you don't even call me Godfather. So I think the media thought that was, interesting or comical or whatever, and they hijacked
even though you
that.
haven't seen the whole movie, that's exactly what you were using it correctly.
Well, the press hijacks things into directions where they want to go. The thing that's the most troublesome about the press is when they're almost, I would call it retweeting almost. They're re-reporting. So one reporter says something that's quasi-true, and then somebody else hijacks it and makes it in a completely different context, which can actually make it literally the opposite of the truth, but suddenly it gets a life of its own, and then it can go on that way. And this is why I really don't like doing any more print interviews, because I can't control the content. I'm much more comfortable talking to you on camera, because at least you're not putting words in my mouth. You can try to twist things around if you want to try, but it's much more difficult then if you're reporting, I mean, I had a run-in with a major news outlet. I won't mention names, but I was at an airport, I'm reading this article, and they had slipped my name into it in a way that was completely a non sequitur. And basically, by that time, I was, if you did an article on me, you got eyeballs. You got top go, you got most read on Bloomberg and all that. So the reporters would just put my name in things, and they'd try to somehow get into the headline because people do alerts and they want to read the story. So they got my name in this headline, and I called up the reporter, and I'm like, I have nothing to do with this story. And he says, well, I'm not going to change it. So I ended up talking to the senior editor, and I said, this story I have no place in the story, and that's bad enough, but how you're using my name in the story is actually completely flipped the context, and the meaning that you're giving in the context of this article is completely misleading. And he goes, of course it is. We're intentionally misleading.
Oh, gosh.
That's what he said to me.
And we wonder why nobody trusts the media.
He said, we're intentionally misleading. And I just said, well, I can't. So I never spoke with that news organization again.
What would you say to somebody who encounters adversity in the workplace? They're young in their careers. What were some things that guided you outside of being inserted into a situation where you could really shine, which is great? But what kind of guidance would you give people coming into the workplace today, which can be a hostile place?
What I did, I would not recommend to people. And that is, I didn't take very much risk with my career. And I think that young people should take a lot of risk. I'm talking like in their 20s.
Okay.
And I was just focused on this place where I was. And one of my personality traits, which probably is a double-edged sword, is that I can be sort of an optimizer. So I'm in a situation and I optimize it, but I don't look for other doors.
Right.
I'm interested in optimizing where I am. And I think that I should have started my own company in 1992. 1993 at the latest. And instead, I just was one more day until 2009. So many years later, because, you know,
so
just don't plan.
Don't get comfortable.
Yeah, I would encourage people to be more planners and more proactive than most people are comfortable being. But when I started DoubleLine, I had some young people that joined up that had been working with me prior, and there was one, and I said, you know, I wasn't paying people anything until I realized, was told that was against the law, that California have to pay people some minimum amount. We weren't even really a company yet. We were just a SWAT team trying to work together.
Yeah.
And there was one person who was 23, and I said, aren't you afraid coming here? I mean, you're not making any money. And she said to me, Jeffrey, I'm too young to be afraid.
Gosh, to go back there.
But when I was 23, I think she was 23. When I was 23, that's when I wasn't in any kind of a situation optimized, but I certainly wasn't afraid. I got into a car and drove across the country without any idea of what was going to be there when I crossed the California state line.
Is the idea of failure cliche? Are you a turn the cheek or an eye for an eye kind of a person? I
am best defined by my astrological profile, where I'm massively Scorpio. I've actually I used to date a girl whose father was a professional astrologer, and it's remarkable how...
You don't hear this every day.
It's remarkable how this guy was helping people with astrology. It was pretty remarkable. So he did mine. And he's like old school. He didn't have a computer. He was charted out by hand. This goes way back. I mean, this is back in around 1980. And every astrologer's always said the same thing. They look at my chart and they go, I've never seen anything like this. I mean, you've got this the sun and Mars, which governs Scorpio,
Yep.
and Venus, and they're all on top of each other. You're just unbelievably Scorpio. And they're right, because you can kick me around a lot, and I'll tolerate it up to a point.
Mm-hmm.
And then once you really step on me, you're dead. So that's how I am. I roll with the punches pretty well, so I'll turn the other cheek for a while, as long as it's, just kind of nuisance stuff.
Right.
But then when you really, really kind of get to me, people really just kind of get dead to me at that point.
Surround yourself with Virgos.
I dated a number of Virgos. Yeah.
Let's shift gears, because financial literacy is a big problem.
It sure is.
In this country.
Actually, financial illiteracy is what's taught.
Illiteracy.
That's what's taught. If that's possible, it's possible to teach illiteracy. I mean, you start out illiterate, you have to be taught to read,
right.
You become literate. But I actually think most of what's taken for granted is actually taught illiteracy. My best example of that is when the consumer spending data comes out every month. There's always a big cheer if there's a lot of spending, and there's an extra loud cheer if that spending is based upon a huge increase in debt.
Oh,
because what they say is, oh, this is a wonderful sign because it shows that consumer is confident,
yes, confident
in the future. And so a huge pile of debt gets twisted into a positive thing. And
remember, I used to work inside the Fed.
Yeah,
so.
You hear this all the time. I mean, that like home ownership is certainly preached, but most people never own their home.
Well, that's the thing. It's not home ownership.
They're just renting. They're renting for another 30-year lease.
Right.
Because even now we have huge refinancing that's going on.
Oh yeah.
We're actually back to almost 2003 levels for some of the cohorts that were recently written. And these people may have been, most of these people are probably only a few years in, but they're people that are 10 years into their mortgage, and then they re-up for another 30
years.
I think I heard that some almost impossible sounding fraction of retirees actually have mortgages.
Oh gosh, yes.
Which just shows you how ingrained.
Oh, I want to say it's close to
20%. It's incredible. How is that possible?
That's servitude. That's not retirement.
No. So there's a lot of financial illiteracy, a lot, and it keeps getting pushed. I mean, there's a new class in financial literacy that was just rolled out, I think, this year. It's ever smaller participation vehicles into the stock market. There's this thing called slices now.
Oh, yes.
Where you can actually buy $5 of a stock.
Right.
And then I think there's an advertisement on some of the financial media where they say you can be diversified with 10 slices for only $50. And I think first we had the futures contracts, then there were the mini futures contracts, and then there's the mini contracts to allow a broader base of participation from less and less sophisticated people.
Well, but are they learning anything?
They're going to learn. They're learning how they're going to learn through the school of hard knocks.
Right.
What's going on at the top of the stock market here in the United States in February, around February 19th or so, there was a record of call buying by the little investor for these little mini calls that you can buy now. There were 7 odd million contracts on these, and that was shattered any record. But presently, at least a couple of weeks ago, that record was totally taken out, and there were more than 12 million. It was not a little bit taken out, that record. It was shattered.
Oh, Robin Hood.
So what they're learning, they think they're learning that you buy the Nifty 50 and Xerox takes you to 153, but when it goes back down below 40, that's when they're really going to learn.
Oh yeah.
And this is the Nifty 50.
I was reading a story on the wires that the guy who runs Robin Hood had to get bulletproof glass.
Yeah.
Because investors who had lost money were.
These people don't even understand that that you can lose more than all your money on some of these options trades.
That's right.
So they could open. There's an anecdote. I don't know if it's an urban legend or not, that somebody opened up their statement and it said negative $730,000.
Oh, it's not an anecdote. It's a real kid.
And apparently he threw himself in front of a train.
Yeah.
But I heard subsequent to hearing that story that actually he misread it. And
oh,
he didn't,
gosh.
And so it's doubly tragic. But that can happen.
Well, but I've got school-aged kids. They've never come home and said, "Mom, I'm going to plot a stock and watch it for a week or whatever." The basic foundation's just not there.
Well, that's correct. But the problem's much deeper than that. The problem is that people don't understand the concept of saving money before you buy something.
That's right.
I've talked about this on my webcast. There's a incredibly funny, but just a golden nugget of a clip from Saturday Night Live from years ago. It's when Steve Martin was on the show.
Oh gosh. And
it's absolutely perfect. It's this couple is in the kitchen. Steve Martin and I can't remember, Jane something, or I think her name was and they're in the kitchen table fretting over their credit card bills. And what are we going to do? We're all this debt. And all of a sudden this guy shows up, comes on camera, and he goes, "Read my book." And he goes, it's called "Don't Buy Stuff You Can't Afford." and they're like, "What?
I don't understand.
What does that mean?" And he goes, "Well, look at page 1. Save money before you buy something." Go, save money?
Yep.
And he goes, like, "Well, wait a minute. If I don't have the money but I want something, I can buy it, right?" And he goes, "No, you can't buy it." "Really?"
Yep.
And then he says, "But where are you supposed to get all of this saved money?"
Yep.
It's an absolutely classic sketch.
Yeah, I'll never forget
sketch.
what my current doctor and favorite medical doctor once said, "Danielle, don't look at diets. If you want to lose weight, eat less." He's like,
eat less and exercise more.
It's pretty simple.
Yeah.
And it's the same concept.
You know, we were really at a point at one point when I was a kid where we were really scratching to get by, and we were at the supermarket and we didn't have enough money, and we had to put stuff back.
Yeah.
And I said to my mother, because there were no credit cards before 1970.
That's right.
So here we are. Credit cards had just kind of come around.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Why don't you just put it on the credit card?" And she just looked at me and she says, "Let me tell you something. Never, ever, ever put food on a credit card, ever. Never borrow money to buy food, because that's a slippery slope which ends potentially very badly." I never forgot that. But also when I was a kid, there were no auto loans.
Nope.
They didn't exist. You had to save the money and go and actually buy the car.
And now you can take 7 years.
No. Well, it's come this far. It's because, you know, it's one of these things where everyone knows that borrowing money to buy food and leveraging up on your car, and, you know, on that note, it's funny. I was listening to the radio a while ago, and they were talking about how there was such a steep decline in the prices of used luxury cars. And I mean luxury cars, Lambos, Ferraris.
Right.
And they were down like 50% in a year. And this was before COVID. This was when the economy was good, right?
Right.
And they said, you know, the prices have gone from like, I'm just making up numbers, but $300,000 to $150,000. And I was like, how could that be? I mean, the economy's okay.
Yeah.
And the reason was that they had toughened up on the lending standards for used car loans. I was like, people are borrowing $300,000 to buy a Lambo?
Oh yeah. Their payments are like mortgage payments.
So it's one of these things where everyone knows that this is a bad way to go, but it's one of those things where in the short term, there's a payoff. And it's just like our national debt. It's just like so many things that, you've been saying that this is a problem for years, and look, everything's fine. Yes, it's a problem in the long term, everybody says, but you know, that could be a long, long way away. But what happens is you glue enough short terms together, and all of a sudden the long term is today. And we're getting closer. We may not be there yet, but boy, we've taken a mighty leap forward this year in terms of heading towards, you know, the debt cliff.
Do you think that there's, because I'm seeing it, I'm hearing it, I'm seeing anecdotes of people who are saying, I've learned to live with less.
Sure.
I don't know what I was thinking.
Sure.
Do you think that...
I think that's permanent.
Do you think that COVID has the potential to make saving great again?
Yes, I think at least on the margin. I mean,
because what, 38% of families with the $100,000 of income didn't have a penny of savings coming into this.
Right, and when they were staring into the abyss of no savings and potential job loss without perhaps a safety net from the government.
And they made too much to get stimulus checks.
They must have been really having a hard time, because that must be a really scary thing. And I think that could be a lasting lesson, but I think there's more doses of this lesson to come. I think that there's going to be a lot of people who are going to have to learn to live with less. They've already been got the fear of God put into them that they were staring into the abyss a few months ago. But what about...
You need to save for a rainy day, and all of a sudden it's raining.
What about the deflation that would be caused by a third of the labor force working from home? I think I saw something that a third of people want to work from home all the time.
Yep.
Well, if they live in Los Angeles or San Francisco, why don't they just move to, some town in Texas or something? And there's no taxes, it's certainly cheaper real estate, and obviously I'm going to pay that person less. So that puts deflationary pressure on all related people in that, whatever position that is. They're looking for work. And the government seems reticent to give money to people that are more than double the median household income. And those are people that probably could lose their jobs or get downsized to a lower wage simply because there could be pressure for those positions. I think that...
Well, companies are in a cost-cutting mode right now.
They're in a cost-cutting mode.
There's no doubt about it.
And the COVID thing has provided, the work-from-home experience has provided, I believe, I know it has for me, insight into sort of the performance that is being delivered by individual employees.
We've spoken about
At
that.
Every company, I know, I have almost 300 employees. We do our best to be better than average, but of course not everybody can be better than average by definition. And so I think we've got less fat than most places, but there's got to be a lot of organizations that have a lot of fat in it. And that fat is being revealed.
It certainly is.
Jack Welch, when he ran GE, used to lay off something like 10% as a policy. A policy of laying off 10% every year, just because you want to keep people motivated, you want to keep them, it's sort of a stick, give them a carrot on the bonus and a stick on the fear. But it kind of shows you that he believes that 10% is fat every year. And so I think there's insight that's being provided, and I think there's going to be a lot less demand for commercial real estate.
Oh gosh, if you think about central business district, cities in America that rely on public transportation, and how much office property is in kind of the top 10 markets, again, that rely on public transportation. There's just enormous amounts of, and this is the one asset class nobody really talks about, but it is levered up to the hilt.
Yes, it is. Yeah, I mean, the whole commercial building thing was in plain sight for the last few years, just staring you in the face. I mean, I just can't get over how many hotels have been built.
Oh gosh.
I just can't get over it.
50% of them are full service. Who's going to occupy these hotels?
Everywhere. I mean, I grew up, we talked about Buffalo, New York. In the 90s, there were no hotels to speak of in downtown Buffalo. I had to go there on business. I had to stay at like a Sheraton downtown. It was like a war zone. It was terrible. You drive down that same street today, there's a hotel like every block. They're everywhere.
Every small city in America has been gentrified.
And since when? Buffalo's actually a great destination, particularly in the summertime. It's one of the best places in America. But most people don't think, unless they are informed about this through a referral, they don't think, I gots to go to Buffalo this year, right? Even though it's super nice this time of year. But these hotels, they're up and operating, and they're still building more.
That's how private equity works.
Yes.
On volume.
Yes, and you have the higher the risk of these projects. You get a little extra yield, and the Fed has been more than helpful in getting people to hold their nose and divert their eyes from the risk and look at that extra yield. I mean, there was an interesting situation that's going on now, because when the COVID hit, there were all kinds of liquidations in credit. Corporate credit, junk bonds, everywhere. It was much worse market than the worst day of the global financial crisis in March and April. There were literally times when there was no bid. It lasted
Now, there was one night when there was no bid for treasuries in the middle of the night in Asia.
That's right. And then the Fed finally showed up. After the Fed showed up, money started pouring into junk bonds and corporate investment grade, not so much loans, but certainly in the regular bonds, started pouring in. And that ended up dragging a lot of other things slowly higher as well. Asset-backed securities, mortgage-related things, commercial mortgages.
Leverage loans have even started to kind of tick back.
Suddenly, in the last few weeks, there's kind of a dearth of supply in those areas. And people are doing stranger and stranger things in order, it's just the opposite of March, where they had to unload everything. Now they're trying to find things that have a little bit of extra yield on them. Now that the Fed has the 10-year Treasury down at 60 basis points and the long bond at 1.3 and T-bills at 0. So today, this very day, there was an issue rolled out by Amazon warehouse. Okay, now Amazon is obviously a good company. This bond is a 6-year bond. It's rated single A. And they talked it at a yield of 3%. Okay, 3%. And that was deemed to be so attractive that the offering had 10 times the subscriptions as the amount that was going to be floated. It's coming next week. So what that means is that the yield is going to be significantly less than 3, because they're just going to keep lowering the yield until 9 out of the 10 people or nearly that drop out. It could easily end up being 2 3/4.
So we're going to
grow. I know Amazon is a better credit, but it's only single A rated.
But industrial is the one place that they've decided is going to be the chosen asset class, and it's going to be the part of the commercial mortgage-backed space. It's not going to get hurt in the whole thing. I mean, but back up for a minute, because you're talking about a mania in junk bond issuance. June was the largest month on record.
Yeah,
but it was also
corporate bonds broadly have broken all records.
But it was also the highest month since 2009 for bankruptcies. What the hell is going on?
There's a viewpoint that troubled areas, and it's not articulated this way, but this is the way I think about it. Troubled areas, partially due to the Fed's policies, have been allowed to get so large that there's a perception, probably a misperception at the end of the day, that the prospect of them en masse going bad is so frightening and so economically devastating that it won't be allowed to happen. It's really the airlines. It's happening. The airlines did it too.
It's very managed. But
it is happening.
We have okay, so today you wake up and it's Brooks Brothers, and tomorrow it's Sur La Table.
It's going to continue. And this thing about the airline bailout, which you keep your employees for a few months.
They've already been fired ahead of time.
I know. That's what I was getting to. And we've given them $58 billion when they used $45.5 billion to buy back their stock. So in essence, we bought back their stock at a 25% profit, except for one thing: we don't own the stock.
Right.
They still own the stock. We bought essentially their buybacks off their hands, and we don't even own the stock. And but what's happening, right? So why did that happen? Well, we can't let all these people go. We can't lose all these jobs during March and April. Well, you're going to lose them anyway, because they've already pre-announced the layoffs en masse at both United and American Airlines. And of course, there's no way out for them under a capitalist regime other than bankruptcy. That's the only way out. I mean, their debt is absurdly high. I'm talking about just American Airlines, to pick one. Their debt is so high, and what we're doing.
And they just raised $2 billion.
What we're doing is adding to their grotesque debt burden relative to their equity. So it's obviously, again, it's not a solution. It's just short-term versus long-term.
But what we're seeing though is companies filing, and this was the holder of Ann Taylor and Lane Bryant brands. So we're going to file.
Yeah.
There's 3,000 stores involved. We're going to liquidate 1,200 on day one. That's not the way you normally see Chapter 11, but there's so much debt out there that there's so much little left when you file. What are you going to give the creditors?
I think the one that the history books will really reference is the Hertz equity offering.
Oh gosh.
A Chapter 11 company that's issuing equity?
Yeah.
How is that possible? Well, it turned out it wasn't possible.
Okay, so
they couldn't get it done.
So you're getting to the crux of the matter. Has the Fed permanently changed the rules of engagement? Will fundamentals, have they negated the ability for markets to signal distress? Has the Fed won?
In parts of the market, they have won for now anyway. In other parts of the market, they have been appropriately absent. So we can talk about junk bonds, where the prices have been clearly propped up. The Fed really went all in April 9th. I think they announced corporate bond buying March 23rd, but it was really April 9th that changed the game. And that's when the ETFs that own corporate bonds went up like 5-8 points in a minute. And so if you analyze a basket of junk bonds, I can't call them high yield because the yield isn't high, so we have to call them junk bonds. The price that the Fed is in essence paying for them is clearly not a market signal. It's clearly a targeted price by the Fed, and it's probably higher than what you're going to get after you work through the bankruptcies on a basket of high yield bonds. So in that sense, the Fed has won in terms of eliminating volatility in the corporate bond market, but they haven't really won in terms of investors getting all their money back, because it's one thing to have a price set every day, it's another thing to have a recovery that comes out. Now in other parts of the market, we mentioned excesses in commercial lending. The commercial mortgage-backed securities market, down in the capital structure, so the way it works is you don't just buy a loan to a building, that loan then gets risk tranched, if you will.
Right, they're like the subprime loans of yesteryear.
Somebody's holding the bag down here, and they're probably wiped out. I think everyone knows that at this point on certain parts of that market. And as you move up, you get to double B ratings, which is a high junk bond rating, a triple B rating, which is the lowest notch of investment grade.
Right.
Those areas have barely rallied since the awareness of rent forgiveness and the depths of the potential problems. So I think you're actually getting a signal there. I actually think that part of the market is really dicey.
Oh gosh.
It's really risky. So this is not something that you want to do at home. But this reminds me of what happened in the mortgage market for residential loans back in 2008, where it turned out that the market was so overwhelmed that prices got pushed down so far that actually a professional, which I like to think that I am, in that sector actually has opportunity. It's just that you have to have a risk profile that can take it.
Right.
Because many of these assets, they were sold new issue at a dollar price of 95 or something. They went down to no bid, literally, but maybe 40. Maybe they're 50 today. They haven't rallied up that much because the market is trying to just parse out where that cliff is, and you have to do it, if you're a prudent person, you have to look at that without the most optimistic case as your base case.
Right.
You've got to have a...
Well, you've got what, a 25% delinquency rate in hotels alone.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you price that risk unless you are a professional?
Right, and you have to, and what's interesting about that is thanks to the Fed coming in and putting their kind of holy water on parts of the market, like AAA CMBS is doing great. Long cash flow AAA CMBS sold today at a yield of 99 over the 30-year, so it was 2.29%. That's because it's got the halo effect underneath it. But as you go down the capital structure, you actually get real prices. And when I talk to high-risk investors and I say, this is something you might want to look at, they go, oh, no way. I mean, cruise lines, hospitality, hotels. And I go, look, that's actually where you're getting real prices.
Somebody's going to buy it.
That's where the real prices are. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to make money,
right,
but you could make an awful lot of money under a certain outcome. So you might have a good risk-reward profile. But yeah, so the Fed has certainly gone where they've never gone before.
Mm-hmm.
And that is interesting to me, because I'm sure you're aware that the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 does not allow the buying of corporate bonds.
No.
And we have not amended that, and yet we're in direct violation right now.
Well, I think the Treasury Department has done a leveraged buyout of the Fed using Enron accounting. That's how I like to.
Yeah, that's colorful, but I think that's
off balance sheet.
I think it's kind of on target.
Well, it's kind of illegal. But
yes, but what that tells me is when somebody is now doing things outside their charter, it means that they might do it again. You know, it's like one of those things. I mean, if somebody cheats on their spouse, you know, it's sort of like, gee, maybe they will again. I mean, right?
If you look at the fine print, they're set up to buy equities at BlackRock. They just haven't announced the structure yet.
They're awfully close, aren't they?
But it's, well, all you need is a few down days, and then they'll cross that last Rubicon.
There's actually one more Rubicon beyond buying stocks that worries me the most. That's declaring that their liabilities are legal tender and not being a lender through this, you know, facilitating this LBO, as you call it, but actually saying we're just now allocating money. That's the true money printing. And the true money printing has a perfect record historically of failing. And you can go to Rome, you can go to France in the late 18th century, you can go to the Weimar Republic, it's all the same. You go off of any real money, you go into a money printing scheme, and what happens has been universally correct through human history that I can identify. That is, the people that were poor starve to death, the people that were middle class turn into what the poor used to be, and the people who are in the center of the money printing mechanism get ridiculously wealthy because they make sure that the money trucks make extra deliveries to their house. And this ends up enraging the starving people and the people that have had a big haircut to their standard of living. And so they do things like march from Paris to Versailles in the pouring rain, barefoot, in numbers of the thousands, if not tens of thousands, to try to, well, they ended up taking Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette back to Paris. They didn't kill them right away, but they made them prisoners. And that's what ends up happening.
But we're not, I mean, far be it from me to say, but I mean, watch the news. We're not that far.
We're getting closer.
Well, talk to me about inequality, because up until recently, it was kind of seen as this area of philosophy. It was just kind of something to bandy about and talk about as if it was abstract in nature. Yeah. I think it's pretty real.
It's very real. When you see that Bezos is pushing 200 billion, you know, in personal wealth, and I think what's unfortunate about the inequality situation is that there is truth, partial truth, to the idea that these people that are on the, you know, the winning end of the inequality, a lot of them don't pay hardly any taxes at all. And there is partial truth to that. Unfortunately, that partial truth has most Americans, even those that are upper middle class, believing that nobody that has created wealth for themselves has really paid any taxes. It's completely untrue. I had a massive tax increase from the Trump tax plan. I had a huge tax increase because I lost my deductibility for my state income tax, and I'm paying 13.3 to Sacramento on virtually all of my money. So I actually pay a huge tax rate. And
yet the perception is...
I actually say this to people, and they say, you don't even pay 20%. And I say, how can you dictate to me what I'm paying in taxes? I know exactly what I'm paying in taxes, and it's over 50% between state, and this is just income tax, between state and federal. So the fact that Mitt Romney paid 14% in the year that he used when he was running for president, That, unfortunately, sells the partial truth as a universal truth. You know, that he's paying a ridiculously low tax rate versus somebody that's making a fraction of what he's making. And that, it leads to the fact that that partial truth exists, and it exists particularly for those that are mega on the side of winning in the inequality.
Right.
It gets people angry.
Well, what's the better way? Where do we start as a country? I mean, it's a really small question, I know, but is it education reform? I think education reform is a glaring topic that begs to be addressed. Mm-hmm. Because, you know, when the civil rights movement was really happening in the 1950s, and you had Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, yep.
and it was about striking down the separate but equal Plessy versus Ferguson ruling from decades before. You know, the people in the South didn't want to get rid of the segregation, I think, largely speaking, at least the politicians that were in charge. But they made an argument that carried a lot of water. And it was, aren't your schools really segregated up in Boston too? Mm-hmm. Aren't they really?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, aren't they really segregated in New York City today? Aren't they really in Los Angeles today? Aren't they really segregated? It's not exactly by skin color so much, but de facto, there's a lot of that in there. And it has a lot to do with opportunity that we need to introduce opportunity again. Because what we've done, when the topic of universal basic income started to come up with Andrew Yang and the like, a lot of people thought this is a cockamamie idea. We've been doing a version of universal basic income since the 60s. It's called welfare.
Right.
All right? Now, welfare was, you could sell it as being caring, but you could also sell it as being very uncaring, because you're basically making a bargain with a certain segment of the population. We'll give you a subsistence type of lifestyle, right. And in exchange, you and your kids and your grandkids will never have any real opportunity.
Right. There's never going to be a way out.
It's a devil. It's a bargain with the devil. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, that kind of was. Lyndon Johnson knew that when he went gung-ho into it. He knew. I think he made the statement that thanks to the programs, the Great Society programs, that certain segments of the population would be democratic for decades to come. Yep. And he was absolutely right. I mean, it's interesting, Kanye West is provocative and he's acting like he might be running for president, which is pretty interesting, because if he actually ran for president, I think he would take Biden's chances away. I think they would be gone.
Kanye West is Ross Perot.
It's the strangest thing, because it's sort of like, in a weird sense, the African American community is in charge of our elections. They're in charge of it because, for reasons that might be good or might just be historical, their votes go overwhelmingly to the Democratic candidate every single time. If they just split their vote 50-50, there would be much more of a dialogue that was going on.
Right.
But instead, they're just taken for granted. And so, in a weird sense, black community has much more political power than they think if they will just seize it. And Kanye West has kind of shown the light, I think, that way, because if he actually, one black man said, I'm going to run for president, I think he controls the election. Mm-hmm. So Kanye West sure isn't disenfranchised. He's probably the most politically powerful person in this moment that we're experiencing right now.
Well, talk to me about this moment, because I think I speak for a lot of Americans who don't feel like they have a choice on November the 3rd, who they don't feel, and they felt this way for a generation. This is not about one man or the other. It's not that. But
well, it's because you had the Republicrats basically take power, where you went from Bush to Clinton to Bush to Obama. It's all the same thing. Nothing happened.
You also had Democrats move over to the side of corporate America at the same time.
Sure.
So you had mixture on both sides, but at some point, I'm talking about middle income workers in America, people who are making $120,000 and branded as wealthy.
The Republican leaders don't care about the middle class voice at all. That's what Trump tapped into. He's kind of a Republican himself. So, but he was enough of a differentiated product, particularly because he was running against, the dynasty,
right?
Literally, he was such a differentiated product. They managed to get him over the hump. But there really is no difference there. And I think what happened is, with the Republican entity coming into existence, suddenly every politician in the so-called Democratic and Republican Party pretty much were influence peddlers. Used to be the Republicans were influence peddlers, and the Democrats were trying to stand up for the smaller voice, but that got thrown by the wayside, and I don't think people identify that with laser precision, but they feel it. They feel that something's wrong. I heard this analogy I thought was perfect. I think it was Joe Rogan, which I've listened to only one of his podcasts, but it was on this podcast. And he said, it's sort of like your immune system. You're like, white blood cells are all gathering somewhere. They're not sure what's wrong.
Right.
But they just know that something's wrong. They can sense it. And that's where we are. And
can we have a third party?
Absolutely, we can.
Do you believe in long cycles?
I believe that if the election were 2021 instead of 2020, there would be three parties. I just don't think there's enough time.
Right.
And Kanye could probably try to pull it off, but it's just so hard to register in all these states and all of these things. But when I look at labor force participation, which fell during the global financial crisis and then rebounded somewhat in recent years, thanks to COVID, it got down to 52%.
Right.
If that goes below 50, you got yourself a third party.
True.
You got yourself a winning third party because you call it the locked out party, the unemployment party, the left behind party.
We're watching the layoffs climb up the income ladder.
It's going to continue.
We're witnessing that right now.
I think it's going to get a lot worse. And I think that's going to put a real new kind of fear into what I call middle management type of people. They might realize that, what they've worked towards, the skill set that they've developed, may not be in demand. I remember when I was, years ago, it was in 1992, I was doing a road show for a closed-end fund we were doing. And it was such retail politics. We were driving around in rented white Tauruses. For some reason, they were always a white Taurus. And I was driving around with a Dean Witter wholesaler.
Oh, gosh. And
we would drive from small-ish city to small-ish city and pull into the Dean Witter retail office. And there'd branch. And there'd be a team of about 20 people there. And we always went and bought them donuts, because that's how you would get them to come to the meeting, by buying them donuts. And I would give them our pitch. And then we would fold up the little easel thing, put it in the trunk of the white Taurus, and drive 2 hours to the next meeting. We'd do like 6 of these a day, every day of the week. And one of those things where you wake up and you have that horrifying feeling, which I think I only had on these road trips, where you actually wake up and you go, I don't know what city I'm in.
Oh, gosh.
I don't know where I am. I'm in another Marriott, they all look the same.
Oh, yeah.
So anyway, as you're driving those 2 miles, you got to have something to talk about. So this Dean Witter guy was saying, you got to understand, things can change really profoundly almost overnight. He said, I had this great gig. I was selling limited partnerships, like payphone leases, the biggest rip-off products ever. They had a 20% load. And these guys were jamming them to retail investors.
Yeah.
And he said, I was literally, got up one morning, I turned on the radio, and I heard the news, and I looked in the mirror, and I was out of business. He was legislated out of business by the stroke of a pen.
Yep.
And he said it was just so life-changing, because it was just another day. It was just he'd been doing this for years, and that was all just taken away from him. Well, that could happen to people, not just who are baristas or maids in hotels. This could happen to these middle management people who think that they're, they feel completely embedded. The system has been largely unchanged for their whole career.
Confidence in job security right now and prospects for jobs are in different zip codes.
Right. Very different zip codes. And they're sort of like, they start to realize this could start happening to me. And if it happens to the guy in the office next door, or the woman who they carpool with or whatever, they start to go, wait a minute. This might not be the level place to stand that I always thought it was.
It's one thing to say that a retailer that you thought was going to go out of business, that process was expedited. It's another thing to wake up and see that Wells Fargo is going to lay off tens of thousands of people. It's just they're different.
I'll tell you about personal experience regarding that. We have a lot of wildfires in Southern California, but most of them are out in the hills and so on. And I would hear, there's wildfires. And I would it was always somebody else's problem. I live near the ocean, and it's just not typical. So one day in January of this year, late January, it's a Monday, and I get up and I always check what's going on, and an evacuation map for Southern California. I'm like, isn't that interesting? And I just keep looking at it, and it took me like a minute and a half to finally accept the fact I'm in the evacuation zone.
I'm on that map.
This isn't some guy 75 miles away like it usually is. And I kept looking at it. No, I'm in the zone.
Yep.
And so I'm like, uh-oh. So we're like, let's get a U-Haul. And we spend like 4 hours putting stuff together, putting in the U-Haul, ready to go. It turned out that we were at the edge of the evacuation zone, and we were very close to being evacuated. We never were. But it's that sort of, that crack of doom thing where you think, this can't, that's somebody else's problem. And I think there'll be growing experiences, an increase in the experiences of that type of crack of doom moment.
So presumably there'll be Band-Aids along the way. There will be another iteration or
had a couple
two
tourniquets,
of stimulus, and we'll get something before the election.
For sure.
So let's weave in sovereignty. Do you see, I think the 30-year bond just had the most incredible auction ever.
Yeah.
But look further down the path. Do you see the debt of the United States? They downgraded China. Fitch downgraded Canada. I'm pointing north. Do you think we'll get downgraded?
No. I don't think you can plausibly downgrade a bond issuer who can pay in their own currency.
Well, they did it in, August of 11?
Yeah, that was a mistake. I think that they were overstepping their boundaries. I think the rating agencies are supposed to opine on the probability of you not getting your money back. I don't think they're supposed to opine on the purchasing power of the money you get back. And that's what they were in essence doing, I think.
Okay.
They were worried that the value of the dollar would be put in peril, but that's not their job. Their job is to say, are you going to get your money back? And Warren Buffett was right on this. He said they should actually have upgraded it to quadruple A, because you can absolutely print your way out of it. You can absolutely pay your debt back. Will it be worth anything? Well, I think there's two possibilities. That you cut the promises to pay, which is very, very politically challenging. The United States now has about $154 trillion of unfunded promises to pay, 7.5 times GDP. There's no way that you can pay that back in purchasing power.
Nobody talks about that, by the way.
Well, one way to think about it is if you decide we're going to fund these. And we know it's a long slog, so we're going to do it over 75 years. You'd have to take 10% of your GDP in today's dollars and put it aside. That would be a 75-year depression.
Yeah.
So it doesn't seem possible that you can pay it back with purchasing power. So you either have to default on them, which is possible. You can default on pieces of Social Security pretty easily. Just raise the age. Just raise the age. Raise the age from present age to, let's go crazy and say 80. That solves it. Solves the problem.
Yeah.
Now,
well, see, all that actuarial stuff is really handy.
That's right. It solves the problem. But the problem is so solvable, and yet you have to be it's like chemotherapy. I mean, you've got to be fearful of a worse outcome, and that hasn't happened yet.
Well, okay, so let's weave ever so briefly the small subjects of China and COVID into this discussion, and reserve currency status, and our place on the global stage, their place on the global stage. 116 countries joined together with Australia to demand an independent inquiry into the source of the virus. So
that's theater.
Okay.
I mean, it's not going to make it go away. It doesn't change anything. But China has one really big advantage over a system like the United States has, and it's also a huge disadvantage. But everything's always a double-edged sword. And so their big advantage is they're an autocracy. That's a big disadvantage for human rights, but it's a huge advantage for long-term planning, because you don't have to worry about somebody scuttling your plan 4 years from now and starting another plan. So I had lunch with Henry Kissinger years ago, and he loves to tell these stories of his rubbing elbows with the world powers. And he told me that he had a dinner with the leader of China, and this was many years ago, and the leader was impressing upon him how they have a 100-year view. We have a 100-year view here in China, and it's fine with us if it takes 100 years for us to officially have Taiwan back. We don't care one bit. And then Kissinger said that he subsequently had dinner with the same guy 30 years later, or maybe his successor at this time. And he said, you know, I was told 30 years ago that you can wait 100 years for Taiwan. Is that still the case? Can you still wait 100 years? And he said, well, that was 30 years ago, so we can wait 70 years.
See?
Right? But they have that plan. They have.
I mean, is reserve currency status part of it?
They have gold. Of course, they want reserve currency status. Of course.
Is military in there somewhere?
Of course. Yes, they are obviously ascendant. They speak. I haven't been to China in a long time. I went there from 2005 to 2009 every year. I can't tell you how much it changed over that short period of time. I went there and I met with like real senior people in finance, you know, Bank of China people, like head guys or deputy head guys. And the first time I went there, I got one type of reception, and it was they were a little bit docile, I would say. And then in 2009, the reception was confidence, strength. They were sort of like, well, we'll see what happens. We'll see what they had a lot of moxie that they didn't have in 2005.
And they still do.
This is 11 years later. It's got to be 10x.
Oh, sure.
What it was in 2009.
And American companies are discovering that even though they've gotten a lot of lip service, that the door is only partially open, and that whatever, 11 years ago, that they weren't 17, 18% of GDP.
American consumers are waking up to the reality that we've borrowed a ton of money to buy plastic trinkets from China on vendor financing. And we've even gone so far, and people woke up with the COVID, they've gone so far as to have one source of certain essential things, and that's China for supply chains and other things.
24% of US auto supplies.
How about pharmaceuticals? Now that we're talking about COVID.
Gosh.
Right? And so they're starting to realize that what was such a great deal with all of this cheap goods, where the debt that you were incurring to buy it was an abstraction. It was on the government's balance sheet, or, you know, and they're starting to realize that they're tied together.
It's pretty real.
And as the building blocks of knowledge are starting to fall into place much more than where you were 4 years ago, on how the system got to this place by short-term feel-good things being the priority, but the land that it takes you to is one that must ultimately fail.
So on that happy note, if you're Joe Q investor and you're being told that it's going to be a V-shaped recovery and that everything's going to be fine,
I don't see how anyone can accept that as a logical statement. Because,
when
because
does this end?
You cannot take 20% of the labor force and have them not produce anything. Mm-hmm. And there's no consequences. Nothing happens. Everyone's lifestyle is the same. Nothing changes. Mm-hmm. No, that's not mathematically possible.
So at some point they'll pull the extra stimulus. They'll mortgage forbearance will go away. Rent moratoriums will disappear.
Eventually they must. I think they're going to last a lot longer than they're letting on, because it's kind of got the tiger by the tail. You don't want to let them go. There's
no cap on the debt ceiling until June of 2021.
Jay Powell says our ability to quantitative ease buy bonds is infinite.
Yep.
That's a pretty bold statement. I mean, it was like in the days when there were actual live telephone solicitors and not robots. They would actually call up, and you'd answer. Back in the days when you'd have a landline, this is years ago. This guy calls up, and he's trying to hard sell me on something. He was a guy. He was an Indian accented guy, and I go, look, I have absolutely zero interest. There's no chance of me buying this thing. You're just completely wasting your time. And he goes, very strong opening position. And I almost wanted to buy the thing from the guy, because that was just a great
That's
statement.
brilliant.
That was just a brilliant, right? But that's what Powell just did. I mean, very strong opening position.
Right.
In infinite, well, there's no infinity.
There is no
but
infinity.
He means that there's no ceiling.
Right. So what's an investor to do to protect themselves? Is there any? I mean, there has to be an end game here. I'm sorry, but
I hate to give a financial media type answer, but in this case,
are you going to say diversify?
Yes, and I hate that answer, because that's an answer that people give to hold their clients' hands through rough times.
Right.
But in this case, since there's such a binary outcome, that there could be confiscation and there could be debasement, both. Mm-hmm. And it's really almost a policy choice, but it seems that one of those choices is going to have to start to be at least discussed seriously in polite company. And so you have to, I wouldn't say diversify, you have to barbell.
Right.
Barbell. So you have to own things that will survive debasement. Mm-hmm. And
hard assets.
Yeah, hard assets. And you have to own, the reason to own stocks would be that at least if we're going to add 2 zeros to the price of everything, we probably add 2 zeros to the price of stocks too.
Right.
So at least you're probably kind of floating along okay. The idea that you're going, I mean, I saw somebody.
You don't mean that stocks are not going to correct.
You can always manipulate them. The Fed has manipulated the corporate bond market. I think absent manipulation, the stock market would be in serious trouble unless there was a true money printing exercise. I mean, the stock market has a PE that is at such nosebleed levels relative to sober earnings. And as we all know, all of the earnings growth the past 5 years is the Super Six.
Yep.
FANG and Alphabet and all that stuff, yep. Microsoft. Away from that, there isn't any earnings growth at all in the last 5 years, which means that earnings are actually down if you hadn't had a tax cut. And if Joe Biden wins, and he promises with glee, he promises to reverse the tax cut,
yeah.
Well, how's that going to affect the PE of the stock market? It's going to make it not just 25 on forward earnings, and we're getting within spitting distance of the highest ever forward PE. And so that would be a really big problem. But it's the most narrow market ever, and so should you own zero? No, because it's one of those barbell weights. But I think hard assets, and that's not very good advice to John Q. Investor, because John Q. Investor doesn't have any savings.
Right.
And
that's the thing. Hard assets require liquidity to get into.
These people that are buying $50 of slices, they're not going to get rich on $50 of slices. No. They go up 10x. Which I saw a guy on a financial program very recently. It was actually June 8th, which was the top so far of this rally of the stock market, and it was June 8th. And there was actually a guy who said, "I've been bearish. I've been wrong. I was too bearish, too conservative in April, and I've reevaluated. I think this is the best buying opportunity of my career." I had to rewind it and watch it several times because I can't believe it. Really, at a PE of 25, this is a better buying opportunity than March of '09, when the PE was single digits, right? I mean, that kind of mentality is, they'll learn the hard way.
Look, you've given me a lot more time than I was planning on, so this has been a real treat. I have one last really, really hard question for you.
Okay.
Are the Bills going to win the NFC East?
They almost assuredly will if there's a season. And that's what makes me so frustrated, because we suffered through 17 years of no playoffs for the Bills. And then we kind of side-doored in through a miracle play by the Cincinnati Bengals, and we didn't really deserve to be there. But then we did deserve to be there last year. We actually earned it. And the Bills are clearly ascendant, and they actually look like one of the best teams in the NFL. And isn't that just the perfect torture for the long-suffering Bills fan, that when you're just about to start on an upswing, they kneecap you and pull the chair out from under the season, and there isn't one. But I think almost assuredly the Bills would win the AFC East if there's a season.
Well, I'll be cheering for them. I'm not a big Cowboys fan, so thank you. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
All right, go Bills.